Sometimes the most important thing you can do isn't to explain or demand clarity. It's to step back quietly. No announcements, no drama, just a calm withdrawal of your time, your energy, and your availability. Because when you disappear with self-respect, something unexpected happens. His ego doesn't get louder. It starts to crack. And not because you tried to hurt him, but because you finally chose yourself. When we hear the idea of vanishing quietly, it's easy to assume it's a strategy designed to get a reaction, a way to make someone miss us, panic, or suddenly realize what they've lost. But that mindset already puts your power in the wrong place. Quiet disappearance, when it's done in a healthy way, isn't about manipulation or punishment. It's about boundaries. It's the moment you stop forcing yourself to stay emotionally present in a situation that keeps asking you to shrink, overextend, or tolerate less than you deserve. Many people remain available long after they feel unseen because they're afraid of being misunderstood or replaced. So they keep explaining, they keep justifying their needs. They keep hoping that if they say the right thing in the right tone, the other person will finally step up. But what often happens instead is that their availability becomes expected rather than appreciated. The more you give without reciprocity, the more your presence feels guaranteed, and the less urgency there is for the other person to change. A boundary is not a threat. It's not do this or I'm gone. It's a quiet internal decision that says, I will no longer participate in something that erodes my self-respect. When you disappear quietly, you're not trying to teach someone a lesson. You're honoring the signal your own emotions have been sending you all along. The discomfort, the confusion, the constant overthinking, these are not signs that you need to try harder. They're signs that something is misaligned. What makes quiet disappearance so powerful is that it doesn't invite debate. There's no dramatic exit, no emotional explosion, no long message outlining every disappointment. Drama gives people something to argue with. Silence paired with changed behavior does not. When you stop initiating, stop rescuing the connection, stop being the emotional glue holding everything together, you're no longer negotiating your worth. You're simply removing yourself from a role you were never meant to carry alone. This kind of boundary requires courage, because it means accepting that you may not be immediately understood. You might not get closure. You might not get an apology. But closure doesn't come from someone else finally validating your experience. It comes from deciding that your peace matters more than being right or being chosen. Disappearing quietly is often the first time someone chooses their long-term self-respect over short-term reassurance. There's also a deep shift that happens internally when you do this. You stop scanning your phone for messages. You stop replaying conversations in your head. You stop measuring your value by someone else's consistency. In that space, you begin to reconnect with yourself, your routines, your confidence, your sense of control. You remember what it feels like to exist without constantly performing emotional labor for someone who isn't fully showing up. And if his ego starts to break, it's not because you intended it to. It's because access was removed without explanation. People often only realize the value of what they had when it's no longer available on demand. But whether or not he reflects, reaches out, or feels regret is no longer the point. The real transformation has already happened the moment you chose not to abandon yourself anymore. There's a common belief that if we just explain ourselves clearly enough, the other person will finally understand our feelings and change their behavior. So we rehearse conversations in our head, craft long messages, and wait for the perfect moment to express everything calmly and maturely. But ego doesn't respond to explanations the way we hope it will. Ego listens for reassurance, for continued access, for signs that it still matters. That's why so many heartfelt conversations lead to temporary apologies, but lasting change rarely follows. When you explain, you're still engaged, you're still investing energy, you're still showing that no matter what happens, the connection remains open. To an ego, that open door is comforting. It signals that you're not going anywhere, that there's time, that there's no real consequence to inconsistency. Words can sound meaningful, but as long as access remains uninterrupted, there's little pressure for reflection. Removing access is different. It's not loud. It's not confrontational. It doesn't come with accusations or ultimatums. It's simply the absence of what was once freely available, your attention, your emotional presence, your responsiveness. That absence creates a gap, and the ego feels gaps deeply. Suddenly, there's no immediate reassurance, no instant reply, no emotional safety net. And in that quiet space, questions begin to surface that no explanation could ever force. The reason ego cracks more from absence than from emotion is because emotion gives it something to lean on. Tears, frustration, even anger all communicate that the bond is still alive. Silence paired with consistency communicates something else entirely, that you've made a decision and you're at peace with it. That calm withdrawal is unsettling because it removes the sense of control. The ego is no longer being fed by your reactions. It's important to understand that this isn't about withholding as a punishment. You're not pretending not to care while secretly hoping for a reaction. You're genuinely stepping back because you've realized that access to you is a privilege, not a guarantee. When that access is removed without drama, it forces the other person to confront the reality of the situation on their own terms, without you guiding the narrative. Many people underestimate how much emotional labor they provide in a connection. They remind, reassure, initiate, smooth over awkward moments, and keep things alive during lulls. When all of that stops, the silence becomes noticeable. The ego, which once relied on your presence to feel secure, suddenly has to sit with uncertainty. That's when reflection begins, not because you demanded it, but because there's no longer anything distracting from it. What makes this shift so strong is that it doesn't require you to say a single word. You're not asking to be understood. You're not defending your feelings. You're not waiting for permission to step away. You're simply aligning your behavior with your self-worth. And whether or not the other person ever fully understands why you left becomes irrelevant. If he reaches out, it's often not because of the last conversation you had, but because the absence made him feel the loss of access. And if he doesn't, that silence becomes information rather than rejection. Either way, you've stopped trying to explain your value to someone who was comfortable benefiting from it without fully honoring it. For many people, love slowly turns into an audition without them even realizing it. They start adjusting their behavior, softening their needs, and over-delivering in hopes of being chosen. They respond faster, forgive quicker, and tolerate more, believing that consistency and effort will eventually be rewarded. But the moment you feel like you're proving your worth instead of being appreciated for it, the dynamic has already shifted out of balance. Auditioning often looks like being endlessly understanding, never wanting to rock the boat, and telling yourself that your needs can wait. You minimize your disappointment, rationalize their inconsistency, and stay because you believe your patience says something noble about you. Over time, though, this creates a silent hierarchy where one person is being evaluated and the other holds the power of decision. And as long as you keep auditioning, you reinforce that imbalance. When you stop auditioning, everything changes. The shift isn't announced with a speech or a confrontation. It happens quietly in the way you move, respond, and prioritize yourself. You no longer chase clarity from someone who is vague. You no longer overextend to maintain momentum. You stop filling in the gaps for effort that isn't there. This is not withdrawal out of bitterness. It's withdrawal out of self-awareness. The reason this shift is so impactful is because it removes the illusion that you were always available for approval. When you stop performing, the other person is suddenly faced with the reality of who they were dealing with, not someone desperate to be chosen, but someone who had options and self-respect. The energy changes from "convince me" to "this is who I am," and that alone can be deeply unsettling to someone who grew comfortable being the decider. There's also an internal transformation that happens when you stop auditioning. You begin to ask different questions. Instead of "how do I make this work?" you start asking, "does this actually feel good to me?" Instead of wondering how to be more desirable, you wonder whether this connection aligns with your values. Your attention moves away from earning affection and toward protecting your emotional well-being. That shift alone restores a sense of power you may not have realized you'd lost. The other person doesn't suddenly notice this change. But over time, the absence of your extra effort becomes obvious. Conversations feel flatter. The emotional cushioning you provided is gone. And that's when realization can set in, not because you demanded recognition, but because the dynamic no longer runs on your overfunctioning. The relationship has to either rise to meet you or reveal that it never could. Choosing yourself in this way doesn't guarantee that someone will step up, and that's the point. When you stop auditioning, you release the need for a specific outcome. You no longer measure success by whether you're chosen, but by whether you're being true to yourself. And paradoxically, that grounded self-assurance is often what makes someone see your value more clearly than all the effort in the world ever did. When you remove yourself quietly from someone's life, what often surprises people most is not how the other person reacts outwardly, but what happens internally. If someone had grown accustomed to your emotional presence, your reassurance, your patience, and your willingness to smooth things over, your absence creates a silence that can't be easily dismissed. And when that silence is peaceful rather than dramatic, it becomes even more unsettling. There's nothing to argue with, nothing to blame, nothing to point at except the empty space where your energy used to be. Emotional labor is often invisible to the person receiving it. They may not consciously notice how often you were the one checking in, keeping conversations alive, offering understanding, or absorbing uncertainty so things could stay comfortable. Over time, this support becomes part of the background. It's expected rather than appreciated, and as long as it's there, there's no reason to question how much weight you were carrying for the connection. When you vanish quietly, that emotional labor doesn't get replaced overnight. Suddenly, there's no one filling the gaps. No one making things feel okay when they're not. No one translating silence into patience or inconsistency into hope. The calm absence you leave behind forces the other person to sit with the raw version of the dynamic, without your efforts softening it. That's when discomfort begins to surface. Peace is especially unsettling to someone who relied on your reactions. If you had left in anger, it would have been easier to label you as dramatic, emotional, or unreasonable. If you had argued, it would have given them something external to focus on. But calm withdrawal removes those distractions. There's no emotional chaos to hide behind, just a quiet awareness that something meaningful has shifted, and that shift didn't require conflict to happen. This kind of absence can trigger reflection in ways confrontation rarely does. Without your emotional availability, the other person may begin to notice the weight of what they no longer receive. The reassurance that once came automatically now has to be generated internally. The comfort of knowing you'd be there regardless is suddenly gone. And in that space, the ego often feels exposed, not attacked, but unprotected. What's important here is that this effect isn't created by intention. It's a natural consequence of no longer overgiving. When you stop providing emotional labor without reciprocity, the imbalance becomes visible. and visibility creates awareness. Whether or not that awareness leads to growth is beyond your control, but the mirror has been placed. This process is equally transformative. When you stop carrying someone else emotionally, you begin to reclaim parts of yourself that were quietly depleted. Your nervous system calms. Your thoughts become clearer. You realize how much energy you were investing just to keep things stable. And in the absence of that effort, you start to feel lighter, more grounded, and more present in your own life. If his ego starts to feel unsettled, it's because peace has replaced the dynamic he was used to. And peace doesn't negotiate. It doesn't explain. It simply exists. In that stillness, the reality of what was taken for granted has room to surface. Not because you demanded it, but because you finally stopped doing the work for both of you. One of the most common mistakes people make when they start to outgrow a situation is believing they need to announce it. They feel the urge to send a final message, post something symbolic, or make sure the other person understands how much they've changed. But real growth doesn't require an audience. In fact, the more you feel the need to explain or declare it, the more likely it is that you're still emotionally tied to the response you hope to get. Growth shows itself through behavior, not speeches. It's in what you stop tolerating, what you no longer chase, and how you choose to spend your time and energy. When you truly shift internally, there's nothing to prove. You don't need validation for your progress because you can feel the difference in how grounded and clear you are. That kind of change doesn't need to be explained, it's felt. When you disappear quietly while growing, the message is subtle but unmistakable. You're no longer available in the same ways. You don't rush to respond. You don't overinvest in conversations that go nowhere. You don't try to manage someone else's emotions or rescue the connection when it starts to fade. This isn't coldness or indifference. It's alignment. Your actions finally match what you know you deserve. Announcing growth often invites debate. It gives the other person an opportunity to minimize it, question it, or promise change without real follow-through. But living your growth removes that possibility. There's nothing to negotiate with. Your behavior has already changed, and behavior is the language people believe most. When words and actions no longer contradict each other, your presence becomes calmer and more self-contained. This kind of quiet change can be disorienting to someone who knew you as the person who would always explain, always try again, always give one more chance. They may sense that something is different without being able to pinpoint it. You're still kind, still respectful, but no longer accessible in the same way. That shift communicates maturity far more effectively than any declaration ever could. Living your growth means releasing the need to be understood by someone who benefited from the old version of you. It means trusting that the right people don't need a press release to notice your evolution. They feel it in the way you show up, the boundaries you maintain, and the standards you quietly uphold. There's also a deep confidence that develops when you let your life speak for itself. You stop checking whether your absence is noticed. You stop wondering what conclusions are being drawn about you. You're no longer performing growth for approval. You're simply inhabiting it. That grounded energy is steady, not reactive, and it naturally reshapes how others experience you. Living your goals also keeps you focused on what actually matters, building a life that feels honest and fulfilling to you. Your attention shifts from managing perceptions to creating peace, and in doing so, you send a powerful, unspoken message, not that you've changed, but that you've moved forward. It's easy to tell yourself that the purpose of disappearing quietly is to make someone regret how they treated you. The mind looks for justice, validation, and a sense of balance after feeling overlooked or undervalued. So it imagines the moment when the other person finally realizes what they lost and feels the weight of that mistake. But when your healing depends on someone else's regret, you're still emotionally tethered to them, even in absence. True freedom begins when the outcome no longer controls you. The moment you stop measuring your progress by whether he thinks about you, misses you, or reaches out, something loosens inside. Your emotional world stops orbiting around a reaction you can't control. Instead of waiting for a realization on his side, you begin to experience clarity on yours. And that clarity is far more stabilizing than any apology could ever be. When you shift the goal from his regret to your freedom, your behavior naturally changes. You stop checking for signs. You stop reading into silence. You stop interpreting every day that passes as evidence of your worth. The energy that once went into monitoring him starts flowing back into your own life. Your routines strengthen. Your sense of self becomes less fragile. You're no longer negotiating with uncertainty. You're building consistency within yourself. This is often when the other person feels your absence most strongly. Not because you planned it, but because you're no longer emotionally available in the background. There's no tension to engage with, no lingering attachment to sense, just a quiet, grounded distance. And distance without bitterness can feel final in a way that anger never does. It signals that you're not waiting to be chosen anymore. Freedom also means accepting that some people may never fully understand the impact they had on you. They may never articulate regret in the way you imagined. And if your healing requires that moment, you remain stuck. But when you release that expectation, you reclaim your power. You stop outsourcing your peace to someone else's awareness. Choosing freedom doesn't mean erasing the past or pretending you weren't hurt. It means refusing to let that hurt define your future. It's the decision to stop revisiting the same emotional loop, hoping for a different ending. Instead, you create a new one by stepping out of the pattern entirely. That's not avoidance, it's growth. As you walk forward, your focus shifts toward alignment rather than validation. You begin to value how a connection feels over how it looks or what it could become. You trust yourself more deeply because you've proven that you can walk away from what doesn't honor you. That self-trust becomes the foundation for healthier relationships, whether with others or with yourself. If his ego cracks along the way, that's incidental. It's not your responsibility to manage or monitor it. Your responsibility is to protect your peace and choose a life that doesn't require you to abandon yourself. And in doing so, you discover the real victory wasn't being missed or regretted, it was being free. Vanishing quietly isn't about making someone feel the loss of you. It's about finally feeling whole without them. When you stop explaining and stop carrying the emotional weight alone, you don't lose power, you reclaim it. And in that calm self-respect, whether or not his ego cracks becomes irrelevant, because the real shift has already happened within you.